Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here to speak to you this morning about my research, and I would like to thank the committee for inviting me. I did receive partial funding, which is noted here on the slide. So the rationale for my study: why study Mexican American women? Why did I decide to do that? I had conducted previous research with Latina and 4 different subgroups, including Mexican American, regarding the cultural context of postpartum depression. And my own cultural background made me very aware of the barriers and challenges that immigrants face when coming to the United States. I also observed in my own clinical setting of labor and delivery and maternal child nursing that my peers were not very savvy about caring for diverse cultures, and more alarming to me was the fact that they were not interested in learning more about caring for diverse cultures. This lack of knowledge resulted in a lack of culturally competent care that led, in my experience of observation, to some very negative patient care outcomes. Mexican American women immigrating to the United States from Mexico bring cultural beliefs, practices, and values regarding health and well-being, and maternal child nurses who are caring for Mexican American women. Also, the statistics for the Hispanic population, of course, the numbers are continuing to increase. And so this means that there is an increase in the United States healthcare system for services and resources to these women. The purpose and domain of inquiry of my study was to discover, understand, describe, explain, and analyze the emic or insider expressions, meanings, beliefs, and practices and experiences of Mexican American women during the postpartum period. And the domain of inquiry was Mexican American women living in Passaic, New Jersey. I had 3 research questions for my study. How do Mexican American women describe the postpartum experience? What are the generic cultural expressions, meanings, beliefs, health and self-care practices and experiences of these women during postpartum? And in what ways do the worldview, culture, and social structure and ethnohistory influence the care and expression and meanings and beliefs and practices and experiences in the home and community context for Mexican American women? The theoretical supports for this study was Leininger's theory of culture, care, diversity, and universality, along with her Sunrise Enabler, which we'll see on the next slide, that allowed for an in-depth cultural assessment. This is a depiction of the Sunrise Enabler. So it enabled me to conduct a very in-depth cultural assessment that allowed me to search for those very broad dimensions of humanistic care embedding in the worldview, and also in the ethnohistory, language, and social structure as well. The model, as you can see, is multi-directional. Therefore, everything is interconnected and everything influences the care beliefs and practices, and also indicates how we as nurses can provide culturally competent care by using Leininger's 3 action modes that are depicted at the bottom of the slide. The significance for nursing is that the Mexican American birth rate is approximately 50% higher than non-Hispanics. It is the youngest of the Hispanic subgroups, with a median age of 29.5. And Mexican American women face multiple barriers in accessing healthcare that include socioeconomic, cultural, and linguistic factors. And there is minimal research about Mexican American women's postpartum health variables and practices. The review of literature indicated there was no existing research regarding Mexican American women's postpartum practices. There were few studies at all on any aspect of Mexican Americans' health. Anita Berry in 1999 study focused only on the prenatal experiences of these women, and Gallo's study in 2003 only focused on the birthing or intrapartum experiences of Latino in the United States, not specifically Mexican American. The study design was qualitative. It was the ethnonursing research method where Leininger combined her knowledge of anthropology as well as ethnography, plus nursing to develop this method that was congruent with her theory. And Leininger states it is a very natural, open discovery, inductive method that really presents to us the informant's worldview. The setting and sample was in Passaic, New Jersey. The interviews took place in informant's homes, the Catholic Church, Hispanic Information Center, wherever the informant preferred. My sample was purposive, which is a form of convenience sampling. I had a total of 24 informants. 8 were key, 16 were general, according to Leininger's 1-to-2 rule. Leininger is extremely prescriptive. She's been criticized very severely for that. I didn't find that to be a problem. I welcomed that actually as a novice researcher at the time. And the eligibility criteria self-identified as Mexican American, age 18 and older, and being able to read, write, and speak either Spanish or English. I will say that the entry into the community was quite lengthy. It was facilitated for me by the director of the Hispanic Information Center, who did some networking for me and connected me with an RN from the community who taught prenatal classes. She was Mexican American herself, spoke Spanish, and she served as my gatekeeper, translator, and interpreter as well. The key informants were the ones that experienced the postpartum. They were willing to be interviewed for about 1 to 2 times for 1 to 2 hours. And the general informants were knowledgeable and were interviewed 1 time only for about an hour. The recruitment procedure included that initial contact with the informants was made by my RN gatekeeper, first by a phone call at the prenatal class, and also followed up by a snowball method. She was present for all of the interviews, whether they were in English or Spanish. Our consents were written in both English and Spanish, and whichever the informant preferred, we used. Our confidentiality, no names were used. They were assigned codes. Data, of course, was kept in my locked office in a locked cabinet. Any computer stored on my computer was password protected. My RN translator did sign the confidentiality agreement, and we did use private rooms for interviews. The data collection management included, I developed an ethnodemographic data sheet and also an inquiry guide. The inquiry guide consisted of semi-open-ended questions, semi-structured and open-ended questions that guided the interviews. And I also used Leininger's 3 enablers. Leininger changed the name from model to enablers, and basically they're analogous to the formal instruments we use in quantitative research for measuring data. The interviews were continued until saturation of data. I used NVivo 8 to manage the software data and to provide a paper trail, if you will, or an audit trail. The audio tapes, field notes, any observations were transcribed immediately into MS Word and entered into NVivo. And all of my recorded interviews were transcribed into English by GMR Transcription Agency to assure absolute accuracy of the transcriptions. Here is a table of just some of the demographics on the participants. The majority were homemakers. The majority had experienced a miscarriage. The majority identified as Roman Catholic, and the majority were between the ages of 26 and 45. About half had a spouse or partner, and about half stated they were from Pueblo Casa, Mexico. And maybe a quarter of them identified having antepartum or postpartum depression, but they were not formally diagnosed by a physician. And a small percentage as well had witnessed or experienced domestic violence, which was one of those serendipitous findings, because that is a taboo topic that is never discussed outside of that family or culture. None of them admitted to being fluent in English, but actually in speaking with them, some of them were quite fluent. They just felt uncomfortable speaking in English, and so we respected that. and the interviews were conducted in Spanish. The data analysis process, including using all of Leininger's research enablers. I had already mentioned the Sunrise enabler. She has a stranger to trusted friend one and an observation participation reflection enabler that helps you gain entry as well into the community. And I used her 4 phases of data analysis and her 6 major qualitative criteria. Her 4 phases of data analysis include collecting, of course, and describing and documenting that raw data, which are really the interviews. The next step is to identify those categories. And from further abstraction of data, you identify your patterns. The final step in the abstraction of the data is to identify the major themes, any research findings, formulations, any recommendations that you may have. Leininger developed her own 6 qualitative criteria based on Lincoln and Guba's qualitative criteria, but she omitted the dependability and added instead meaning and context and recurrent patterning. So credibility is really the achieved by the prolonged engagement in the field. It is, which takes place for a long period of time. For me, it was well over 12 months. Confirmability is basically confirming with the participants what they have stated for you to make sure you haven't misunderstood or misinterpreted something. The meaning in context is reporting data that is meaningful to the informants within their life experiences. The recurrent patterning occurs again from the prolonged engagement. It allowed me to really see the recurrent patterns that were evident and coming forth from the data. Saturation is with no new data is forthcoming. And that I achieved at about 20 interviews, but I added 3 more to make sure I didn't make a mistake. And transferability and qualitative research is, can we possibly take those findings and transfer them to other similar settings? So from my analysis, 17 categories emerged. You can see them here, and some of these are repeated again in the patterns. I identified 6 patterns that emerged from the data. The importance of family, a key pattern, belief in God as protector and provider of source and comfort every day in life. Seeking knowledge from elder women in the family was extremely important, and they sought knowledge first from these elder women versus going to the healthcare provider. Maintaining traditional values, very important. Caring is doing. It's an action verb. It's not words in this culture. It's doing. And non-caring is not showing any interest. 3 themes emerge from my data analysis. God, family, and prayer are the base of everything in life. That's provide that support and strength and protection to the women. This was a direct quote from one participant. You can see it here. And she was basically stating that when she found out she was pregnant, she put herself in the Virgin's hands, meaning La Virgin of Guadalupe. And she prayed all of the time, especially when they told her that her child would be born with Down syndrome. And so she prayed every day for the Virgin's help. None of the quotes were changed in any way for semantics or grammar. They were stated exactly as they were spoken by the participant to really try and capture the meaning and the flavor of what the participant was saying. Theme 2 was protection of mother and baby. It's transmitted intergenerationally by elder Mexican-American women, influenced by religion, folk, and family beliefs and practices. And again, praying every day for a quick delivery. An illustration in this quote of a traditional healing method of a steam bath, so to speak, with herbs that was given to her by her mother and her grandmother. And she describes that in detail here. Theme 3 was showing interest, being attentive to, speaking Spanish indicates respectful behavior, central to the meaning of care. And again, showing that caring for them is action oriented in these quotes. And also basically stating that speaking Spanish is really very important to them, because then they can be sure that nothing is being misinterpreted or mistranslated to them. Theme 3 is non-caring behavior. This for me was one of the most poignant quotes, and I'm going to read that for you. They have a different treatment for me, and I don't know how, because they may be the difference, because the nurses were mostly African American, they don't speak Spanish. And then when I was ready to leave, they didn't give me a wheelchair. I got to walk the whole way out of the hospital, and everybody was getting a wheelchair, and I got a C-section. I had to carry the baby out of the hospital, and then one of the nurses scratched me over my arm, showed arm, and a big deep scratch. And this to me was just so distressing. And this occurred in a magnet credentialed hospital in one of the local areas. And I was very distressed by that. As a result, from all of my data analysis, I developed a conceptual model, which the schematic is presented here for you, that basically depicts the cultural context of Mexican American women's postpartum period. And again, as you can see, everything is related. Your categories, patterns, and themes are all interrelated. And they actually, if the RN understands and has some education about this culture, leads to culturally competent care by the RN. In terms of findings, postpartum period in Mexican American culture is the most vulnerable. They do follow La Cuarentena, which is where they adhere to the hot-cold theory and follow certain practices. So they want warmth, they want hot foods. We, of course, immediately after delivery want to offer ice cold juices and water, when instead we should be offering hot drinks, whatever they want, sometimes even hot water. Sometimes they refuse the ice pack to the perineum because they believe cold can lead to other sequelae in their recovery period. They rely on family. Again, that prayer is intensified as well. And my informants were not well acculturated to the US lifeways. They very much adhere to traditional practices. They're superstitious. There is a strong belief in folk practices. They do seek advice from La Curandera, who is their health healer in that culture, and they do prefer gender congruent support. They do value prenatal, US prenatal and postpartum care, but they might seek it a bit late because they consider pregnancy a healthy period of time, where we here in the United States consider it a train wreck that's about to derail at any moment. Again, caring is perceived as action-oriented, what we do for them, not what we say, not words, what we do. And respect, speaking Spanish, maintaining those, or helping them maintain those traditional values as well. And this is where Leininger's 3 action modes come into play. Culture, care, preservation, and maintenance. We don't want to change anything in the culture. We want to try and allow them to use their practices and adhere to their beliefs. Sometimes we have to accommodate and negotiate. We do that every single day in the healthcare setting, in our clinical practice. We don't even realize that we're using Leininger. And sometimes, as a last resort, we have to do some repatterning and restructuring, but that means we're really changing something, and that's something we really don't want to do. So it is a last resort. We need much more education for nurses in transcultural nursing and how to really care for culturally diverse populations to deliver that culturally competent care. It's imperative, it's of critical importance for RNs to understand the worldview and lifeways in order to deliver that culturally competent, sensitive, congruent care. And Leininger's 3 action modes and her theory can be used very, very effectively in the clinical setting by nurses today, if they're aware of it and are educated in that aspect. The limitations of the study: my lack of fluency in Spanish. Mothers had pre-school-age children with them. Sometimes it may have inhibited them in some way. The sample was only in low-income women in just one setting. I did not formally measure acculturation, and so that may have been a drawback. And of course, the voluminous amount of data was also somewhat of a limitation. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.